So we talked about how the layout of the page is specified using XAML language. Now let's talk about XAML in more detail. So let's look in more detail on XAML syntax. So as you have probably noticed, XAML is based on XML. So it's an XML file, so it consists of tags and attributes. Whenever you want to add an element, for example, a text block, you can specify several attributes to it. For example, if you want a text block that displays a text, you need to put text equals to hello world. This is pretty obvious and pretty convenient. Some elements have so-called default attributes. For example, if you place hello world here inside the tag, it would be the same as specifying text equals to hello world. This is very useful. For example, if you want the text to be multi-line, if you want it to be big, you can do that. However, different elements can have different default attributes. It depends on the element. And there is also another syntax which is a little bit less obvious. For example, if I want the attribute to be very big, and any attribute, not only default attribute, I can use this syntax saying text block, and inside text block I would put another tag called textblock.text, and this would specify text attribute of the text block. And then inside the text attribute I can put many different things. This can be pretty useful. For example, if I want to specify something like brush, if a brush contains just plain one color, if it's solid brush, then I can just specify, for example, fill equals to red, and the object would be filled with red. But then if I want the brush to be, for example, gradient brush, and to define gradient brush, I would need many I would need a number of tags. Then I can say, for example, rectangle dot brush, and then I can put different tags defining this brush inside this kind of construct. So you need to remember that there are several ways to specify XAML attributes, and you can use any one of them depending on the situation. We will see many examples when, for example, the third notation turns out to be very useful. There are several types of different XAML controls. Let's talk about them for a second. First of all, there are containers. What containers do is they allow to place different elements inside themselves, and they would know how to position those elements. For example, grid allows us to create a sort of table and position elements into rows and columns, and StackPanel allows just simply position one on top of the other. Another number of controls is called collections. Collections is something which contain many objects inside them, but many objects of the same type. For example, if we have something like list box, it is useful for displaying a list of similar items. For example, number of items in the shopping cart or a drop-down list. This can be specified using list box. Items control is the base control. It's kind of contains very basic behavior, and then list box and grid view and list view, they all inherit from items control, and they provide some additional details on how items should be displayed. Then, of course, there are simple elements. Simple elements are useful for displaying something. For example, text block just displays a text. Text box allows us to display editable text, like an entry in the data form. Image allows us to display a picture, an image on the form. Button is a button. We have seen the example of a button already. And then checkbox and combo box, I think that's pretty obvious what they do. And then there are also some very tricky controls. For example, rectangle and ellipse, those are quite obvious elements. They just display those graphical elements, and they can be useful if you want to draw something, some geometric figures on the form. We can use rectangle, we can use ellipse. And for example, if we just want to draw a text box with a frame outside it, we can also use those. Then there are a couple of controls which allow us to pick date and time, date picker and time picker. Quite useful if we need to enter a day or something like that. Then also the hub and pivot controls. They are kind of interesting containers which allow us to display parts of the applications in turn. And then there's also media element which allows to insert video files, audio files into the page. But that's not a total list of all the controls that XAML have, because XAML in fact has quite a lot of controls, but those are most useful ones, and I would suggest you keep those controls in mind because they may be useful for you in your applications. Let's have a look at the example. I will start with an empty page, and for example I want to put a rectangle on it. I would say the rectangle would be 200 by 200 pixels, and then let it color be equal color or rather fill equals to red. So you see here is the red rectangle. I can actually make it a little bit larger so that you can enjoy it better. Okay, now let's see some other ways to specify the same fill color. For example, I want to specify it using the complete syntax. In this case, there would be also another tag, rectangle.fill, and I would put here red. So far so good, that's equivalent to what we have seen. But now let's suppose I want to make it more explicit. So rectangle fill can not only be just a simple word, it can also be, for example, image brush if I want to paint it with an image. Or it can be solid color brush if I want to paint it with one color. So I can say solid color brush with a color red, and that would be the same as before. Or I can say solid color brush with color equals to red. And that's yet another way to write it. So you can see there are many ways to specify in XAML what I need. Suppose I want to make it more complicated and I want to make it, instead of solid color, linear gradient brush. I want a brush with a linear gradient. In this case, linear gradient brush would have more complicated structure. Instead of just writing red, I would need to put some parameters here. For example, I can say gradient stop collection, because as you know, gradient brush consists of several gradient stops. Then I would put one gradient stop with color equals to red, and one more gradient stop with color equals to blue. So you can see now the rectangle is blue. And why is that? Because I would also need to specify offset. So let's say offset here equals to 0, and offset here equals to 1. And now we can see that the rectangle is indeed filled with a gradient brush. So you see, while I can specify the attribute in a simple way, like fill equals to red, I can also specify fill in a very complex way to achieve desired behavior. Now let's start talking about containers. Containers are something which allows us to group elements together. And the simplest container is so-called StackPanel. StackPanel is basically a way to put elements on top of each other or side by side. So it looks pretty simple. We specify the StackPanel. We can also adjust some of its properties. And then inside of StackPanel, we put different objects. In this case, we put them rectangle, ellipse, and then polygon. And you see they appear in the same order in the StackPanel, one above the other. An interesting question would be how they are aligned together. In this case, you see we say that horizontal alignment of StackPanel is left, which means that all of them, that the StackPanel itself is aligned to the left regarding the parent element. And if we want to align the elements inside the StackPanel, we would need to specify horizontal and vertical alignments here for each individual element as well. StackPanel also allows us to place elements side by side, Like if you want to place them in the different order, like rectangle, then circle, and then triangle, we would need to specify orientations equal to horizontal. And this would create the horizontal stack panel. Let's use our knowledge of controls to create a little better weather application. So we have our existing weather application which displays temperature as text. And if we look at the JSON file here, we'll see that it also returns some kind of icon. Icon is the part of the URL which can be used to display the icon of the corresponding weather, like rain or sun or something like that. So let's try to improve our application and also display this icon. What we can do to do that, we would need to create another element of our XAML layout, which is called image. So I have the text block, and under the text block I would create image. I will give it a name like img. I would give it height 200 and width 200. I will also give it horizontal alignment center and let's say vertical alignment center so that it looks beautiful. And that's it. That would be the image. Because we don't know what the image is, we'll just leave it blank for the moment. And then inside our page, we need to load this image. So what we need to do in order to do that, images are represented inside applications by an object called bitmap image. So in fact, my element AMG, I would need to rename one of those. So let me call this pic, and img is my element. So img has the special property called source, which points to image source. In fact, image source could be different objects suitable to be image source, but also bitmap image. Bitmap image is the simplest to use. So bitmap image, I would also need to specify a certain namespace for it to use. Can be loaded from the URL in this simple way. So I would say I would want to create new bitmap image and pass it the URL. And the URL, I take it from the website and I substitute the icon here. So that's how I create the picture. Now let's run this and see how it works. It would again take me some time to start. And now you will see I first see the text, then the temperature loads, and then the image appears right above the temperature. So the problem is that right now I don't have any container, I just have grid, and grid does not know how to align objects. That's why I have two controls, both placed in the center of the page, and that's why one of them overlays the other. So what can I do to improve the situation? I need to place them explicitly inside a container. So I would use, for example, here a StackPanel. StackPanel is the simplest container. And let me put horizontal alignment here to the center and vertical alignment to the center so that StackPanel is aligned to the center of the screen. Then inside the StackPanel I have text block, and I don't need vertical alignment. And outside the StackPanel I have the image. I also don't need vertical alignment, but horizontal alignment should be center. And then I would close the StackPanel tag. So you see I have placed two objects inside the container. Now it looks like they are one on top of the other here in Designer. And I can start the application and see that now it looks supposedly much more beautiful. So here we go, the text, temperature, and then the image. So now we have quite beautiful application. You see it even works when we change the size of the screen. So I think this application is already pretty good to be used in real life. Now, if you want to place them one next to the other, I can adjust the orientation of StackPanel. I can send orientation equals to horizontal, and you see we have the text and the image side by side. Then if I want, for example, this text to be aligned to the center of the image, I would change the vertical alignment here inside the text block, and I would make it center. You see the text now comes to the center. So that's the way we can control the alignment inside the StackPanel container. Another very useful container would be called grid. Grid is something like a table. But grid element, its layout is specified quite differently from the tables used, for example, in HTML pages. The way it works is that first we specify the layout of a grid. For example, we can specify all rows. In this case, it has 3 rows. So we have 3 so-called row definitions. And it has also 3 columns, which are specified in the column definitions. And you can see that column definitions in this case and row definitions, they have the size auto. Auto meaning that the size would be determined automatically from the elements inside. And star means that it would fill all the available space. Then if I have elements, for example, I have this rectangle, and you see it's displayed in the top left corner. To do it, I would say inside the rectangle element, I would specify grid.row equals to 0, grid.column equals to 0. So that's the number of row and column specifying from top left corner and starting from 0. For example, circle, which is in this case an ellipse, has grid row of 1 and grid column of 0. So that's the column of 1. This is the column of the row of 1 and the column of 0, 1, and 2. And the same for the triangle. It goes into grid row 1, grid column 1. Grid can be very useful because in most of the applications, for example, you would have the title of a page and then some elements below. And to separate title from the rest, you can use grid. In fact, grid can also be very useful to create something like the data entry form when it contains the several elements to enter the data. Let's see how can we use the knowledge of grid to create something like that. We'll create the application which calculates the age of a person. So we'll start with an empty application. And let's, for convenience, change it to table mode. So you see that the default container is grid. In fact, it's the default container because in most of the cases, grid turns out to be the most useful container to start the page. We can, of course, change it, for example, to canvas or to StackPanel. But in our case, if we want to create a data entry form, grid is very convenient. You can actually format grid in the designer. Look here, you can click and automatically create 2 grid rows. And grid rows are split in some proportion, which happen to be the place where I clicked. And for example, I want the first header to have the fixed height. I can just say 100 pixels, and the rest can be the rest. Star means the rest. For example, if I want the first row to have 100 pixels and then I want to have 2 more rows which have the same equal height, then I would use 2 row definitions. So that's how I define rows. I can also define columns in the same way. In most of the cases, it turns out to be quite convenient first to define the rows and columns like this, and then to adjust the spacing manually. For example, if I want it to be 3 to 1 to 1, I would do it like this. So in our case, in order for me to save time, I will just put the existing row and column definitions here. So I would have 2 columns for the label and for the entry element, and I would have 2 columns and several rows. So the first row would be text. The first row would define the header. So I would make it text block. I would say grid dot row equals to 0. And then I want the text to fill the whole page across. So I want to span 2 columns. So I would say grid dot column span equals to 2. And then instead of text blocks, I would say h calculator. That would be the name of my application. And I want to make text larger, so I can either increase font size here, or I can do another thing. I can say style equals to theme resource header text block style. And you see it creates automatically something which looks like a header. Resources are a very convenient way to specify styles which define different attributes at once. And theme resource is something related to the current theme, and it will adjust, for example, if I change the theme of the application from dark to light and so on. So that's the very convenient way of formatting. That's the first row. You see that it occupies 2 columns. Now I would then place several labels at the left column. You would see I would have grid.column equals to 0, and I would have grid.row 1 to 3. So those labels occupy 3 rows. Then the first row, I would need to enter date of birth. So I would use the date picker object, placing it first row, first column. And date changed would be the function which is called when I change the date. Then next thing would be gender. And for gender, I would need either male or female. So I would need to place 2 radio buttons inside. That's just for the sake of showing how to do it, because I know that actually the gender of a person doesn't really affect its age. So in order to place 2 radio buttons, here I would use StackPanel, because I just need one on top of the other. So the simplest way would be to use StackPanel, which we already know. And then the third attribute would be a simple text block, which would show us the resulting age. Now, in order for it to work, I need to create this function, which works when we change the date. And here I would place the calculation. I would just say age.text equals to, and then calculate the difference between current time and the time specified in the date picker. So that's how you can create form and place elements in a kind of a table. What I have done here for it to look more or less okay, I have specified the fixed height of all columns. So if I adjust everything, the table itself is not adjusted. But also I could specify variable height, so the table stretches as it goes. Now if I change the date, you see that the age reflects accordingly. Of course, it doesn't look very good because I haven't specified any margins. And for it to look better, I definitely need something like a margin. In this case, probably a margin around the whole grid would look good. So that's the simplest solution. For the grid itself, I would say margin equals to 20. So I hope this would make our whole application look a little bit better. Let's have a look at it. So here it goes. Looks pretty well. So here is the person of the age of 2 days. One more container element which we would consider is called canvas. Canvas is actually quite simple. It puts all the elements as they are in one place, but you can then specify their position inside canvas. So they are not laid out automatically. and you need to take care of their layout by hand. So in this case, we have again rectangle, ellipse, and polygon, and they are just specified without any coordinates. So you see they are placed all one on top of the other. And then if you want to layer them out, we would need to specify their left and top properties. And this can be done programmatically using canvas.setLeft, canvas.setTop, or you can specify it, of course, in the XAML file. So you can imagine that this canvas element can be used to create something like games with moving objects on the screen. Of course, that's not the very best idea to create games because in general, XAML is not the correct technology for that. But let's see how can we create something like a circle moving along the screen using the canvas container. So we'll start with the empty application. And the first thing we'll do, we can change the main container to canvas. And then let me create one element here, a circle, which in our case would be an ellipse because there is no special tag for a circle. So height would be like 20, width would be 20, and filling color would be red. So we'll have the red circle here. I will also give it a name. Actually, let's make it something bigger, like 40 by 40. And I will give it a name. So X column name would be called LL for ellipse. And now I want to ellipse to jump when I tap on it. So it's quite easy. I would look into events, and you would see that it has an event called tapped. Most of the objects in XAML have the event called tapped. So whenever I tap on the ellipse, this function is called. So I just want to send it coordinates to a random number. So in order to do this, I would create in my class a random number generator. I just need to do it once for the whole application. And then I would get the variables. X would be rnd.next, so it would be a random number between 0, and then I need to determine the width of the screen. So the easiest way to do this would be to say window.current, which gives me the current window, then bounds width. So that would be the width of the screen, but it's double, and I need it to be integer. So I will convert it to int. And another thing I will do, I would also subtract width of the ellipse, because otherwise it can go off the screen. So that would give me the x coordinate. And in the same manner, I can get the y coordinate. I will just need to operate with height instead of width. And that's it. Assign it to y. And then I need to set the coordinates. I would say canvas.setLeft. That would set the x coordinate. First parameter is the element, and the second one is the coordinate. And then canvas set top, ellipse, and y. So that would make the circle jump. Let's see how it works. Here is my ellipse. I tap on it, and you see it changes the position quite randomly, but it never goes out of the screen. I can try to make the screen smaller. It would always stay inside. So that may look a little bit like a stupid application, but in fact it's not, because what you can do, you can, for example, create a game when you need to tap a frog as fast as you could. You could also improve this game by making ellipse run away from you as soon as you point your cursor towards it. You can do actually many interesting scenarios. I encourage you to play a little bit with this program and see what you can come away with. So you have seen how Canvas allows us to position elements arbitrarily. So you can probably think that this would allow us to create scenarios like when we want to drag objects and place it in any position on screen. But in fact, another technique is typically used for that, and we'll briefly cover it now. And since this technique is a little bit complex, this next part of the video is a little bit optional, so you can skip it if you don't understand anything. Don't worry. But I think it can be useful in many scenarios, so let's go through it briefly. So we'll talk about the scenario when you have certain element on a page, and then you can drag it around with a mouse or with your finger, and it would move on the screen, even taking some physics into account, a little bit of physics. So to see how this application was created, let's have a look at the XAML layout and then at the source code. So XAML layout, you may think that it's quite simple to begin with, because it contains one image. So the image is still named LL, like in the previous example with ellipse. It also has some fixed width and height. Then I define the image which is shown. And then what I also do, I define the event called manipulation delta. That's an event which is called whenever user starts manipulating the event, the element, like dragging it around. What I also need to do, I need to set the special property manipulation mode to all, so that all manipulation events are passed to this handler. Then when the user drags the element, I would need it to respond. I would need it to be repositioned on the screen. So in order to do this, I would create a special technique called transforms. You see that almost any XAML element has the special property called render transform. And render transform specifies transformation, affine transformation, which can be applied to the element before it is displayed on the screen. For example, here inside image render transform, I can specify several transformations. But the most complex and the most useful transformation of all of them is called composite transform. It's called composite transform because it can perform many transformations at once. For example, I can specify here rotation and the angle of rotation. You can see that the object has rotated on the screen a little bit. Let me magnify it so that it's better visible. So you see it's now rotated 10 degrees. What I can also do, I can also say translate x equals to 200, and it would be moved on the screen. So in this case, you can also change the position of the element, not by altering its coordinates, but by specifying different translation options. And by the way, there are also options like skew, so you can apply different transformations. And you can also specify the center of the transformation if you want to rotate it, for example, not around the center, but around some arbitrary point. So in the beginning, I create this composite transform, but I do not specify any parameters. Like it's there, but it does nothing. And I name this transform, so it will be called trans. Now let's switch to our program. What happens here is that I need to define the function manipulation delta. Manipulation delta is quite interesting function because as an argument, it gets a special argument which contains delta, and it has rotation, scale, translation, and so on, different parameters here. In my case, I want only to move object. So I say that whenever I receive any translation, what I do, I add this translation to the translate x property of the transform which is applied to the picture. And the same with y. So what happens is that when I drag the picture, this event fires. All the translation arguments are passed here, and I add them to the translation of the original object. If I want to take rotation into account, what I would need to do, I would need to say trans rotation plus equals to E delta trans rotation. And this would allow me to rotate the object as well. That would be a little bit difficult to do because the object is pretty small. But let me try, and then we'll see. Maybe I would need to make it bigger to show you how it works. So here is our application. I would move it to the center, and then I'll try to rotate it with 2 fingers. You see, in fact, it can be rotated. It's a little bit difficult though, because the object is quite small. So this can be very useful if you want to implement something like dragging objects into several buckets or any other scenarios when user can freely interact with the objects on the screen. In addition, let's consider a few other interesting elements called flyout elements. Flyout elements are useful if you want to create the interface when something appears on the screen, like the model dialog asking you something, you answer, and then you continue working with the application. So pop-up elements can be just simple pop-up, and you can control whether it's open or not. It can be ContentDialog, which is quite a versatile element allowing you to specify the design. It can be flyout, menu flyout, tooltip, and so on. There are several different options. We will not go through all of them, but let's consider just one. And that is ContentDialog. So ContentDialog is the customizable dialog which is shown to you for a certain moment, allowing you to make certain selection or choice. That's how ContentDialog looks on the phone. On desktop application, it would have slightly different look. The good thing about it is that it automatically adjusts to the form factor. So the way ContentDialog works is that you need to add additional file to your project. You go to project, add new item, and then ContentDialog. And this adds another element similar to a page, but instead of a page, it has the root element called ContentDialog. And in the ContentDialog, you do the same layout as in XAML, so you can specify grids, tables, containers, so you lay it out as you want. And as you finish ContentDialog, then you can easily show it with just a few lines of code. So you basically create ContentDialog, then do show async, and you can get some result back. And ContentDialog allows you just to return 2 results, primary and secondary result. You can specify 2 elements which would serve as a primary button and a secondary button, so they would be visible on the screen. And then you can put any content in between. And you can easily define which result, primary or secondary, has been chosen in this ContentDialog. So as a conclusion, XAML gives you a large variety of controls, and we have just considered some of them. To make the layout, you use containers. You almost never place elements on the form by hand. And containers allow you to position elements automatically or manually. And by placing them manually, you can actually try to create something like games. But in practice, XAML is not really used for games because it's not really performant. If you start moving objects quickly on the screen and there would be a few objects, more than one, then you would see the problems with movement not being very smooth and the problems with performance. How to create games, we'll talk about that later in the course a little bit.